The morning Eli Vasquez decided to carry the alien girl to school was the same morning the Dominion locked the sky. He hadn't planned it. Nobody plans anything at 6:15 in the dark, when the settlement's recycled air still tastes like sleep and the overhead grow lamps are only just warming to yellow. He had been cutting across the lower quad, boots crunching frost that had no business existing in a pressurized colony dome, when he saw her. She was sitting on the low retaining wall outside Sector 7's residential block, the one with the crumbling mortar that the maintenance bots kept skipping. She had her school pack balanced across her knees, and she was staring at the ground with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting long enough to stop expecting relief. Eli almost kept walking. He was 16 and perpetually late, and he had a physics practicum in 40 minutes that he had not studied for. And the girl, Vale, he would learn her name was Vale, was one of the Cathari, which meant she came with complications. The Cathari had been granted provisional residency in Vega Colony 311 months ago as part of the Interplanetary Compact, and in those 11 months Eli had learned approximately 3 things about them. They were bioluminescent. They communicated partly through a membrane vibration that humans couldn't hear. And their lower limb musculature, while perfectly functional in Cathari gravity, tended to atrophy badly in Earth-standard conditions, which the colony maintained because 92% of the population was human. And when you're 92% of anything, you get to decide what normal feels like. Vale's legs were folded beneath her at an angle that looked like it hurt. Her bioluminescence, a faint silver blue that ran along the ridges of her cheekbones and down the outer edges of her four-fingered hands, was dimmer than it should have been. Eli had seen other Cathari in the market, and they glowed like someone had lit candles behind their skin. Vale looked like a candle burning through its last inch of wax. He stopped. "You need help." She looked up at him. Her eyes were large, pale iris, the pupil a thin horizontal slit, and she had the unsettling Cathari habit of holding a human's gaze for exactly 1 second longer than felt natural. Then she looked back down at the ground and said, through the small silver translation membrane affixed below her ear like a second jawline, "The gravity ramp to the transit hub is non-functional. I have calculated 3 alternate routes. All 3 require stair systems. My legs," she paused. The membrane translated a soft tonal sound that had no direct equivalent and converted it, imperfectly, to, "are not in a cooperative state this morning." Eli looked at his watch, looked at the distance to the transit hub, looked at the girl on the wall. He crouched down in front of her. "Put your arms around my neck." She stared at him for a very long time. "You are serious." "I'm always serious at 6:15. Come on." She weighed almost nothing. Cathari bone structure was denser than human, but their bodies ran lean, and she folded herself against his back with a precision that suggested she had calculated the most aerodynamically efficient distribution of her weight before committing to it. Her arms were cool against his collarbone. Her bioluminescence, close up, threw a pale blue shadow across his forearms. He carried her to school. He didn't think about it much on the way. That was the truth of it, the unromantic truth that nobody would have believed if he'd told them. He just walked, and she rode, and they talked a little and were quiet a lot, and it was 30 minutes from the retaining wall to the intake gate, and at the end of it his legs were tired and she said, in the precise and slightly formal cadence of someone whose translation membrane had been calibrated on formal documents, "Thank you. That was efficient." "Any time," he said, because that was the kind of thing you said, not because he expected to mean it. He would mean it. He would carry her the next morning too, and the morning after that. What he didn't know, what he had absolutely no means of knowing, was that a surveillance drone the size of a hummingbird had been hovering 12 meters overhead the entire time, broadcasting the feed to a ship parked in orbit that was larger than most moons. And the being watching that feed, in a command center whose technology made the colony's best equipment look like toys carved from wood, sat very still with her four-fingered hands folded in her lap, and watched her daughter being carried to school by a human boy, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 3 years. It was not gratitude. It was something older and harder to name. 4 months passed. They were not boring months exactly. The colony was the usual mix of interesting and exhausting. There was the water reclamation dispute that dragged through 3 committee hearings before anyone admitted the sensors had just been miscalibrated. There was the week when the dome's outer seal developed a hairline fracture in Sector 12, and everyone had to sleep in emergency pressure suits that smelled like the inside of a medicine cabinet. There was the general low-grade tension that came from 5,000 people living in an enclosed system, sharing air and water, and the particular irritability that sets in when you haven't seen a real horizon in 6 months. Eli went to school. He failed physics, then passed it. He helped his mother carry groceries from the market because the auto trolley had a wheel that stuck. He sat on the roof of the residential block some evenings with his neighbor John, and they watched the stars through the dome's viewport, which was not the same as watching stars from a planet, but was considerably better than not watching them. Every morning at 6:15, he picked up Vale. The routine established itself the way routines do, not through decision but through repetition, each morning arriving and finding the same shape as the one before until the shape became inevitable. He would cut across the lower quad. She would be at the wall, sometimes already standing, leaning against it, pack-shouldered, which he understood meant her legs were doing better. Sometimes she would be sitting in the same folded position as the first morning. He would crouch. She would climb on. They talked more as the weeks passed. Vale's questions were systematic. She was studying. He came to understand, with the focused attention of someone who had been given an assignment and intended to complete it properly. She asked about the water dispute, about how the committee hearings worked, about why humans organize decision-making through argument rather than through consensus modeling. She asked about the market vendor who extended credit to Cathari families, a man named Tomas who Eli had known since childhood, who had given Eli's own family credit during the first lean year on the colony and considered it one of the normal things one did. She asked why Tomas hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Eli tried to explain that Tomas would consider mentioning it to be somewhat beside the point of doing it, and Vale sat with that for a long time, and he felt her thinking it through against his shoulders. She told him things too, in pieces, the way you disclose yourself to a person you spend 30 minutes with every morning. Not all at once, not with any plan, just the gradual accumulation of small facts. She told him that Cathari children did not attend school in the human sense. They were assigned to learning cohorts based on aptitude, which were more efficient and, she acknowledged, considerably lonelier. She told him that her translation membrane had been calibrated on the colony's administrative archives, which was why she sounded like a legal document. She had been trying, she said, to recalibrate it on more colloquial language. She thought she was making progress. "You said yeah yesterday," Eli said. "I did," she said. "In context." "In appropriate context," she confirmed, and her membrane added a tonal quality he was slowly learning to read as satisfaction. He got used to the weight of her. That was the strangest part, looking back, not the strangeness of it, but how quickly the strangeness wore away. She was just there on his back every morning, her cool arms settled against his collarbone, her bioluminescence casting its pale blue shadow over his forearms, the two of them moving up the hill together in the early light. He didn't think about whether it was unusual. It had become, very simply, part of what a morning was. The Dominion arrived on a Tuesday. Everyone in Vega Colony 3 had known they were coming for 6 weeks, because the Dominion did not move quietly. They sent envoys first. The envoys sent forms. The forms required 11 kinds of documentation that the colony's administrative system kept rejecting because the file formats were incompatible, and by the time that was sorted out, the Dominion fleet had already parked itself between the colony and the nearest relay station. It was, as the colony administrator Dr. Reyes put it in her emergency broadcast, a strongly worded parking job. They were not there to destroy the colony. Destruction was inefficient. The Dominion preferred absorption. Vega Colony 3 sat on the outer boundary of the Reach, which was a region of space that the Dominion had been quietly reclassifying from unclaimed to ours for the past decade, and the 5,600 humans and 300 Cathari who lived there had the misfortune of being legally inconvenient rather than militarily dangerous. The Dominion's strategy with inconvenient settlements was called compliance sequencing. It had 9 steps. Eli read about all 9 of them in a summary his school circulated, which tried very hard to make each step sound procedural and bloodless, and succeeded in making the last 3 steps sound exactly as bad as they were. Step 7 was relocation. Step 8 was resource reclassification, which was the document's phrasing for a concept that was clearer and uglier in plain language. Step 9 was... Eli didn't finish reading. He folded the document. He put it in his jacket pocket and walked to the lower quad and sat on the retaining wall for a while, which he had never done before. He sat in the spot where Vale usually sat, and he looked at the ground and tried to think practically about what practically meant. His mother had moved the family to Vega Colony 7 years ago, when Eli was 9, because the colony offered land rights and a new settlement education stipend, and the kind of possibilities that compacted into a word like future, without any of the specific details being clear. She had worked in hydroponics for the first 3 years and in the colony's maintenance coordination for the last 4, and she had built something here, not grand, not spectacular, just real and hers and theirs. The dome and the recycled air and the stuck trolley wheel and Tomas at the market and Jun on the roof with the stars. He didn't know what relocation meant for that. He suspected the document had been deliberately vague about that on purpose. He sat on the wall until the cold got into his jacket, and then he went home. The morning after the Dominion's arrival was when the loop started. He woke up, got dressed, licked jam off his thumb because the auto dispenser was broken again, and walked outside to find Vale sitting on the same retaining wall she always sat on, except that the timestamp on his wrist unit read 06:14, which it always did, and the frost was in the same configuration it always was, and the light from the grow lamps was at the same warm not warm yet angle it always was. He carried her to school. The physics practicum was canceled because of the Dominion announcement. He spent the morning in the colony's common room watching the same official broadcast loop on 3 different screens, each one slightly out of sync with the others, so that the administrator's voice overlapped itself. The content was the same on all 3. He ate lunch. He came home. He woke up at 06:14. For the first 3 days he thought he was just stressed. Stress did things to your sleep architecture. Everyone said so. He would go to bed remembering one set of conversations and wake up to find that those conversations hadn't happened yet, or had happened identically, or had happened with small wrong details, a word changed, a door that had been open now shut. He wasn't sure. Memory was fallible. The human brain constructed continuity out of fragments and called it reality. On the 4th day he tested it. He went to bed with a specific intention. He would take a different route in the morning, not the lower quad path, the long way around through the Sector 4 concourse, a route he never took. He woke up at 06:14 and walked the lower quad path without deciding to. He stopped in the middle of it. He stood very still in the frost in the grow lamp dark and made himself think. He had intended to go a different way. He was going the usual way. He did not remember choosing it. He took 3 deliberate steps toward the Sector 4 concourse. Something in his chest went wrong, not pain, not exactly, more like the feeling of pushing a door that is sealed from the other side, a resistance that was physical and wasn't. His legs kept moving on their original trajectory. He fought it. He got to the concourse, and it felt like dragging himself through standing water, every step costing something he couldn't name. And by the time he reached the concourse entrance, he was breathing hard and sweating in the cold, and the effort had been enormous and irrational. He stood at the Sector 4 concourse entrance. He was still going to be late to physics. He turned around and went to get Vale, because some things you do because you intend to, and some things you do because they have become load-bearing, because the day does not have a shape without them. On the 5th day, he said to Vale, while carrying her up the last hill to the school's intake gate, "Have I carried you through the maintenance tunnel yet?" She was quiet for a moment. Her arms tightened slightly at his shoulders. "No," she said through the membrane. "We have only ever taken the outer path. But I feel like we've taken the tunnel." Another pause. "Describe what you remember." "There's a pressure door about halfway through. The locking mechanism is broken. It swings open when you press the lower left corner. The tunnel smells like copper and old hydraulic fluid. There's a Dominion scanner mounted in the ceiling about 2/3 of the way in, but it's angled wrong because whoever installed it used the wrong bracket calibration. So there's a blind spot that's roughly body width if you stay along the left wall." Vale was completely still against his back. "Eli," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without being asked a direct question, the membrane rendering it with her own tonal coloring, so that it came out weighted in a way English didn't usually allow. "I need to tell you something." The Dominion's compliance sequencing ran on time-lock technology. Vale explained it the way she explained most things precisely, without softening, with a Cathari's fundamental assumption that accurate information was always preferable to comfortable information, regardless of how the recipient felt about it. The time lock was a field generator parked in geostationary orbit that anchored a settlement's local timeline to a specific window. 24 hours, repeated. The goal was to prevent organized resistance. You cannot build a counter-movement if you cannot remember building it. You cannot coordinate if your coordination keeps resetting. You cannot resist a process if you cannot accumulate the memory of having decided to resist. Most species, she said, succumbed within 4 to 6 cycles. They stopped trying to deviate from whatever behavior they had exhibited in the original locked window, because deviation cost cognitive resources they couldn't justify spending when every deviation was wiped clean. They became, in her translation, membrane's approximation of the Cathari word, hollowed, present but not inhabited, going through the motions of a day they couldn't feel themselves choosing. "But you remember," she said. "I remember the tunnel," he said. "I remember things I haven't done yet. Or things I did in a loop that got reset. I can't tell which. That is not supposed to be possible. I'm a notoriously unreliable person," Eli said. "Ask my physics teacher." She made a sound her membrane converted as, something between exasperation and reluctant respect. The time lock interfaces with neural architecture at the memory consolidation layer. Human memory consolidation is irregular. It has redundancies, analog pathways, inconsistent timing. You do not consolidate in clean sweeps the way Cathari do. The Dominion designed the lock for species with orderly memory systems. She paused. Human memory is not orderly. "No," he agreed. "We are famously bad at it." "You are famously bad at it, in a way that makes you resistant to the lock." He thought about that for a moment. They had stopped walking. He was standing in the maintenance tunnel, the real one, the one he remembered before he had technically been there. And the Dominion scanner was exactly where he had known it would be, angled wrong, the blind spot running along the left wall like a seam in something poorly stitched. The tunnel smelled like copper and old hydraulic fluid. "Your mother," he said carefully, "knows about this, doesn't she?" Vale did not answer. "The drone," he said, "the hummingbird-sized one, it's been following us since the first morning." A longer silence, then, "Yes." How long have you known about the drone? Since the morning after you first carried me. A pause. The drone's electromagnetic signature is detectable to Cathari sensory organs at close range. I recognized it on the second morning. And you didn't tell me. I did not believe it was relevant to what we were doing. Your mother was surveilling us. My mother surveils everything within her sphere of responsibility. It is not personal. The pause that followed felt like it might be personal. I chose not to make the surveillance the subject of our mornings. You were kind, and I did not want to complicate that with politics. He stood in the maintenance tunnel and let that sit. So tell me about your mother, he said. The being who governed 40 solar systems was named, in Cathari rendering, something that sounded to human ears like a chord, rather than a word, 3 simultaneous tonal frequencies that human vocal cords could not produce, and human ears could only partially detect. Her translation name, the one she used in compact contexts, was Administratrix Vale and Sora. Vale had shortened it to Mother in their private communications, because Cathari children were allowed one informal register per relationship, and this was hers. She held the oldest standing position in the compact's outer governance structure. She had negotiated 14 territorial accords, arbitrated in 9 interspecies disputes, and formally registered objection to Dominion expansion 8 times in 20 years, twice successfully, 6 times with partial outcome, and never without consequence to herself. She had sent Vale to Vega Colony 3 because she needed a behavioral record. The compact operated on evidence, not argument, not advocacy, not appeal, evidence. Documented behavioral observation, accumulated over a sustained period under natural conditions. The kind of evidence that could not be manufactured or cherry-picked because it had been recorded continuously, without the subject's knowledge that they were being evaluated. The reached territories were coming up for designation review in 8 months. The Dominion had filed a competing claim on 14 of the 22 settlements in the Reach, including Vega Colony 3. Their argument was efficiency. The settlements were young, under-resourced, insufficiently integrated with compact infrastructure, and their populations lacked the civilization indicators the compact used as baseline for protective designation. Vale and Sora believed the compact's civilization indicators were wrong. Not incomplete, wrong. Designed by species that had achieved their own protective designation through military power and economic integration, the indicators valued things those species had in abundance and measured poorly for things they lacked. Things like informal mutual aid. Things like the spontaneous extension of care to outgroup members without calculation of return. Things like the specific stubbornness of a species that kept showing up even when showing up cost more than it gave back. She needed proof that the Reach settlements had those things in quantities that mattered. She had sent her daughter with compromised legs to the settlement that would make the most persuasive case study. The youngest, the smallest, the one with the most heterogeneous population, the one the Dominion would argue was most clearly below standard. She had attached a drone. She had watched. She used you, Eli said. The words came out before he could moderate them. He regretted them immediately and did not take them back, because they were accurate. Vale was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice through the membrane was very careful, in a way he had come to recognize as meaning she was being more precise than usual. She sent me somewhere I would be dependent, Vale said. She wanted to observe how humans responded to a dependent Cathari. If they ignored me, avoided me, responded with hostility or discomfort, that would be data. If they helped me, how they helped me, under what conditions and for how long, that would also be data. A pause. She did not predict the specific form the data would take. She didn't predict me. No, Vale said, she did not predict you. He thought about that. He thought about his mother moving the family to this colony at the end of her resources, on hope and a land-right stipend, building something in a dome on the edge of a disputed region of space. He thought about Tomas extending credit without announcement. He thought about the maintenance worker. He knew her name now. Her name was Priya, and she was 34, and had come to the colony from an overcrowded station in the inner system, where nobody extended anything to anyone, who had spent 3 off-shift hours on a gravity mat for strangers because the work was there, and she had the skill, and the need was real. He thought about Nalan, the man in his mother's film, who had sealed himself inside his apartment and then couldn't escape the same morning, the same empty walls, the same dead self in the bathtub, who was shown his future and refused to walk toward it. The film had always made Eli impatient. He was old enough now to understand why. It was easier to be impatient with fear when you hadn't been afraid yet. "What does your mother need from us?" he said. "Right now, specifically." Getting out of the time lock required getting to the Dominion's field generator, which required leaving the dome. Leaving the dome required crossing the dead zone, a half-kilometer band of compromised atmosphere between the dome's outer seal and the generator's perimeter, where the Dominion had thinned the air pressure to discourage exactly the kind of thing Eli was planning to do. The thinning was psychological as much as physical. The Dominion understood that most species, confronted with a space that felt hostile, would turn back before they needed to. They had correctly calculated the point at which the discomfort of forward motion exceeded the discomfort of staying. They had not correctly calculated for the human tendency to reframe the cost. The plan was not complicated. Eli had a pressure suit, vintage, belonging to his grandfather, rated for environments considerably nastier than a half-kilometer of thin air. His grandfather had bought it on the inner system before emigrating and kept it on the grounds that you never knew. He had been right in the way that anxious people are sometimes right, not because the specific danger they feared came to pass, but because the world turns out to contain dangers they hadn't specifically imagined, and a pressure suit covers most of them. Vale had schematics for the field generator because her mother had transmitted them while making it appear to every Dominion scanner like ordinary atmospheric data. She had the kind of access that comes from governing 40 solar systems. Not dramatic, not showy, just very thorough. And they had the maintenance tunnel, which didn't just go to the school. It went, Eli had discovered in a loop he couldn't prove had happened but remembered clearly, all the way to the dome's outer service ring. They went on a Tuesday morning at 06:14, because that was the only morning there was. He carried her through the tunnel on his back. It felt strange to carry her in the pressure suit, bulkier, less natural than the rhythm they'd built over the months. The suit's shoulder joints were stiff, and she had to adjust her grip. She found a new angle after a few steps, shifting her weight with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been learning the geometry of his back for a long time. "You've done this before," he said in the tunnel's dark. "I adapt," she said. "So do I." "Yes," she said after a moment, and there was something in the membrane's rendering of it that wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite an acknowledgement. Something in between, which he was beginning to think was its own category. The pressure door was exactly where he'd known it would be. He pressed the lower left corner and it swung. They stood at the threshold of the dome's outer service ring and looked at the dead zone. It was purple. He hadn't expected that. The Dominion's field generator threw a violet atmospheric scatter across the half-kilometer that made it look like the inside of a bruise, and he stood in the airlock and looked at it and thought, that is the most deliberate color he had ever seen. Purple as intention, purple as warning, purple as the Dominion saying, in the language of hostile environments, you should not be here. He stepped out. The dead zone was cold and wrong-pressured in a way the suit handled without drama, the way a good tool handles its designed purpose, not heroically, just correctly. His visor readout stayed green. His breathing was measured. His legs found the same rhythm they'd found on every morning for 4 months, and Vale's weight was familiar against his back, and the violet scatter wrapped around them both like something that had not been designed for this particular situation and didn't know what to do about it. Vale guided him with her voice in his earpiece, low and precise. 15 degrees right. The generator is the squat structure, dark casing, no visible markings. The Dominion does not label infrastructure it considers permanent. Confident, Eli said. Efficient, she said. They consider permanence equivalent to self-evidence. He found it. She was right, no markings. No indication that it was anything other than a box that a box-shaped hostile civilization had decided belonged here. He crouched beside it, his knees finding the dead zone's weird terrain, and looked at the panel. Left panel, third coupling from the base. He found the coupling. Behind it there's a phase regulator. Hexagonal, amber casing, warm to the touch even through your gloves. That governs the lock's recursion timing. He pressed the panel, it opened. The phase regulator was there, amber and hexagonal and exactly as described, sitting in its housing like something that had never imagined being removed. He put his hand on it. Eli. Yeah. When you pull this, the loop breaks, but the field is still active. The settlement still has a Dominion field overhead. What changes is the recursion. One continuous present instead of a repeated window. She paused. My mother's argument to the compact becomes admissible the moment the behavioral record has a continuous present to be entered into. Meaning all 11 months of the drone footage counts. Meaning everything counts. He thought about Tomas and his credit. He thought about Priya and her gravity mat. He thought about Dr. Ray's and the wobble in her voice on the broadcast. He thought about Jun on the roof watching the stars through the dome's viewport, which was not the same as real stars, but was considerably better than not watching them. He thought about 5,000 people who had built something in an enclosed system in a disputed region of space, because the word future had been offered to them, and they had been stubborn enough to take it. He pulled the phase regulator. The violet scatter didn't vanish. It shifted a flicker, like a fluorescent light deciding whether to commit to staying on, a moment of uncertainty that felt enormous and lasted less than a second. Then it deepened to a steady, continuous dark, and the field was still there but the recursion was broken, and Eli stood in the dead zone outside Vega Colony 3 with a hexagonal amber component in his gloved hand, and suddenly, for the first time in weeks, it was not 0614. It was 0647. The grow lamps were fully yellow. He was 33 minutes late to physics. It worked, he said. Of course it worked, Vale said against his back. My mother's schematics are always accurate. I was talking about us, he said. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her membrane rendered something that had no clean English equivalent, a tonal combination that the membrane approximated as yes. It worked, but the approximation was imperfect, as it always was, and the gap between the sound and the translation held more than the words did. He turned around and carried her home. They came back through the tunnel. He carried her up the hill to the school's intake gate, the one with the broken lower hinge that nobody had fixed, and everybody stepped around with the practiced inattention of people who have long since classified a problem as permanent. And they stood at the top of the hill in the fully committed morning light, and Eli's legs were burning in a way he recognized as the honest fatigue of something real, not the wrong-pressured resistance of a time lock, just the ordinary cost of carrying a person up a hill, which was both less and more meaningful than it sounded. What happens now? He asked. My mother concludes her presentation. The compact votes. The Dominion is formally notified that Vega Colony 3 falls under protective designation, which makes compliance sequencing inapplicable. How long does the vote take? In your units between 4 and 6 hours, compact deliberations are efficient. A pause. My mother is presenting. You keep saying that like it settles it. Because it does, she said, without warmth and without the need for warmth. It was not a boast. It was a fact, the same way the scanner's blind spot had been a fact, the same way the phase regulator's location had been a fact, something that simply was, that she was reporting accurately because accurate reporting was how she operated. And you, he asked, after this? I have to go back, she said. My mother requires a report, what I have observed, my recommendations. A long pause. There is a compact summit in 4 months. My mother will present the full behavioral record from the drone. I am expected to speak. You're going to stand up in front of a compact summit and tell them about a human boy who carried you to school. I am going to tell them what I observed about human beings in Vega Colony 3 over 11 months of study. The membrane's voice was very careful, which includes a human boy who carried me to school, among other things. What other things? The market vendor who extended credit to Cathari families, who arrived with insufficient exchange currency. The maintenance worker who spent 3 off-shift hours jury-rigging a gravity compensation mat for the Cathari residential block, using parts that were technically assigned to other projects. The school administrator who quietly reclassified 3 Cathari students as requiring accessibility accommodation so that they would receive transit assistance without having to request it formally. A long pause. The boy who stopped at a wall. Eli's throat did something he wasn't going to examine closely. You were watching all of that, he said. My mother was watching all of that. Were you? The pause this time was different. Not the Cathari precision pause before information delivery. Something else. Something that lived in the gap between knowing and saying. Yes, she said. I was watching. He set her down at the gate, carefully, the way he always did, her feet finding the ground at their own pace, her hands releasing his shoulders by degrees, the bioluminescence along her cheekbones brightening as she straightened. He had noticed it always brightened when she stood, like something in her was relieved to be held and relieved to be set down in equal measure, simultaneously, neither feeling canceling the other. She looked at him for the 1 second longer than felt natural. He had stopped noticing the extra second some weeks ago. He had started to think of it as the real end of a sentence, the pause where the actual meaning settled. I want to tell you something, she said, before I go back. Okay. My legs, she said, they have been adapting. For the last 6 weeks, the atrophy has been reversing. The colony's medical system is not aware of this because I did not report it. A pause that was small and enormous simultaneously. I could have walked to school for the last 6 weeks. The morning held very still around them. He looked at her. She looked back at him with those pale iris eyes and the horizontal pupils and the bioluminescence steady and bright along her cheekbones. Veil. I know, she said. Why didn't you? Because, she said, and the membrane struggled, cycling through approximations, and then delivered her words with a plainness that hit harder than anything elaborate could have. I was not ready to. He stood with that for a moment. He thought about what ready meant, and what not ready meant, and the difference between a thing you can't do and a thing you're not done with yet. He thought about a man in an apartment who kept finding himself dead in the bathtub and kept receiving the same morning, until he figured out it wasn't a punishment. He thought about 6 weeks of mornings that had continued to mean something even after the logistical need for them was gone. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. The Dominion fleet left on a Thursday. Dr. Reyes made another broadcast, this one considerably less measured, with what sounded like crying somewhere in her voice that she was professionally pretending wasn't there. The colony's sound system, which had been calibrated for announcements, was not designed to carry that specific frequency and processed it awkwardly, which somehow made it more real. The market was loud in a way it hadn't been loud in months. Not the ordinary market loud of transactions and argument, but the other kind, the involuntary kind, the sound a compressed population makes when the pressure lifts. The Cathari families came out of their residential block and stood in the main concourse, and their bioluminescence was high and steady, filling the dome's recycled air with light that had no business being as beautiful as it was. Every shade of it, the silver blue of the younger ones, the amber of the elders, something between that Eli had never seen before, which he later learned was the Cathari expression of collective relief, a frequency they only produced in groups and only under specific emotional conditions. Eli stood in the concourse and watched it and thought about nothing in particular. Vale found him there. She was walking, unassisted, her Cathari gait unfamiliar to him from this angle. He had only ever seen her seated, or in transit on his back, never moving independently through space. She moved with a strange, deliberate grace, each step placed like a word in a language he was only beginning to understand the grammar of. She stopped beside him. "The summit is in 4 months," she said. "You said that you could come." He looked at her, to the compact summit. As a witness to the behavioral record, the compact sometimes requests human testimony for reach settlements. A pause. "My mother would arrange transport. She is very good at arranging things." "Your mother," Eli said, "owns 40 solar systems." "Approximately." "Right. Will you come?" He looked at the Cathari light filling the dome. He thought about a man in an apartment who kept discovering his dead self in the bathtub, who kept receiving the same morning like a question he hadn't answered yet. He thought about time loops and phase regulators, and the difference between a wall you can't climb and a wall you haven't tried. He thought about how, for 4 months and then some, the most important thing he had done each day was decide to stop. "Yeah," he said, "I'll come." Vale's bioluminescence brightened by a degree he had learned to measure. The ship was, as promised, larger than most moons. Eli stood in a docking bay the size of his entire colony, full dome, 5,000 people, the water reclamation system, and Tomas's market stall, and the retaining wall with the crumbling mortar, and tried to look like someone who found this normal. It was his first time off colony. It was his first time on any ship larger than the intersettlement shuttle that served the Reach. He stood in the docking bay and looked at the ceiling, and the ceiling continued beyond what he could see. Vale walked beside him at her careful, deliberate pace, and he noticed she kept matching her stride to his, not because she needed to, because she was choosing to. Her mother was waiting. The being who governed 40 solar systems was not what Eli had been expecting, which was itself a failure of imagination he should have seen coming. She was Cathari, which meant she had the same bioluminescent ridges, the same large horizontal pupil eyes, the same 4-fingered hands. But where Vale's light was silver blue, her mother's was deep amber, and it did not flicker. It was completely steady, the light of something that had never had cause to dim, that had been burning at full capacity for so long that it had forgotten what dimming felt like. She looked at Eli for exactly 1 second longer than felt natural. He understood suddenly exactly where Vale had learned it. "Eli Vasquez," said the translation membrane at her jaw, older, more sophisticated than Vale's, with a voice that had no gender and no accent and no imprecision whatsoever, as if someone had spent years teaching a machine to be exactly as precise as possible and had succeeded completely. "I have reviewed 11 months of behavioral data pertaining to your interactions with my daughter." "I figured," he said. "I have one question." "Okay." "The morning you first stopped," she said, "at the wall, before you knew who she was, before you knew anything about us, before there was any possible benefit to you in stopping." She held his gaze with the patience of something that had been waiting out longer odds than this. "Why did you stop?" Eli thought about it honestly, the way you think about something when the answer actually matters, when there's no social reward for the comfortable answer, and the honest one will just have to be enough. She looked like she'd been waiting long enough, he said. The being who governed 40 solar systems was quiet. That is the entirety of your answer. That's the entirety of it. Another moment of quiet. The amber bioluminescence held perfectly still. Eli had the impression, not unpleasant, of being evaluated by something very large and very patient. Not judgmentally, not coldly, just with the thoroughness that comes from taking evidence seriously. Then she said, in the same flat, precise voice, "In the compact's formal record, I will characterize this settlement's population as demonstrating consistent and unprompted mutual aid behavior toward dependent outgroup members under conditions of social stress, which is a protective factor the compact formally recognizes." She paused. "Unofficially, what I will tell the summit is that I sent my daughter to this colony because I wanted to know what humans were made of." "And," Eli said. And she said, "Now I know." She looked at Vale, and something passed between them in the membrane vibration frequency that humans couldn't hear. A conversation in a register entirely outside his perception, private and complete. Vale's bioluminescence brightened in a way he had never seen before. Full and steady, both of them lit at the same frequency for one long moment, like two candles deciding to be the same flame. Then Vale's mother looked back at Eli. "You will testify tomorrow. I would suggest sleep. The summit is formal. There will be many beings present whose names you will not be able to pronounce and whose faces you will find alarming." "I'll manage," he said. "I believe you will," she said, without warmth and without doubt, just the flat certainty of someone reporting a physical law she had personally verified. He testified. He stood in a chamber whose ceiling was so high he couldn't see it, and whose floor was a material that showed the stars underneath. Not a screen, actual space, separated from the chamber by something transparent and evidently strong. And he stood on that impossible floor in borrowed formal clothes that Vale had selected for him without asking his preference, which he'd found either presumptuous or considerate and decided was both. There were beings in the chamber he could not accurately describe, shapes he didn't have vocabulary for, one that might have been an atmosphere more than an entity. He looked at the floor instead, at the stars under his feet, and found that easier. He talked about a girl on a wall at 6:15 in the morning. He talked about frost in patterns that repeated. He talked about maintenance tunnels and wrongly angled scanners, and a phase regulator no bigger than his fist. He talked about Tomas and Priya, and the school administrator whose name, he had learned later, was Sujin, and who had spent an afternoon rewriting accessibility codes because 3 students needed transit help, and the formal request process would have taken 11 months. He talked about carrying someone. He talked about it badly, the way you always talk badly about the things that matter most, reaching for the right word and coming up with something approximate, and trusting that the approximation would carry what the right word would have. He was 16, and not a speaker, and he was standing on space itself in front of beings whose civilization indicators had been written by species that hadn't figured out what to do with a boy who stopped at a wall. He finished, he sat down. The compact voted. Vega Colony 3 was granted full protective designation under Article 14 of the Reach Territories Accord, which made compliance sequencing inapplicable by compact law, which meant the Dominion could not revisit them without triggering a formal censure that would cost them 2 other Reach territories they valued considerably more. All 22 Reach settlements were included in the designation, on the strength of evidence from 1 drone and 1 11-month record, and the testimony of a boy who didn't have anything more complicated to say than, "She looked like she'd been waiting long enough." Dr. Reyes cried on the broadcast, properly this time, not professionally. The colony's sound system processed it perfectly. Eli went home. The colony was the same as it had always been, the crumbling mortar on the Sector 7 retaining wall, the auto dispenser that still broke every third morning, the grow lamps that were never quite warm before 6:20. He walked the outer path to school out of habit on the first morning back, and when he reached the top of the hill he stopped and looked back down at the retaining wall, which was empty in the early light. He stood there longer than he needed to. He didn't know exactly what he expected to feel. Loss, maybe, or relief, or the particular satisfied exhaustion of a long thing that was finished. He felt all of those inexactly, in the way that feelings are always inexact when they're the real kind. His wrist unit showed 0647. He was 33 minutes late to physics. He went anyway. The message from Vale arrived 3 weeks later, through a communication channel that had not existed in Vega Colony 3's system prior to its arrival, and which the colony's IT administrator would spend 2 frustrated days trying to understand before giving up and simply routing it to Eli's personal inbox. The message was precise and short, which was consistent with everything he knew about her. It said, "The Compact has approved an exchange program for human settlements in the Reach. Educational and civic observers from established Compact worlds will spend time in Reach colonies, and Reach colony residents will have reciprocal opportunities. The first cohort departs in 6 months. My mother has ensured your colony is in the first allocation. If you are interested, the enrollment documentation is attached. You would be carrying yourself this time. V." He read it twice. Then he read the last line again. He opened the enrollment documentation. The first question was name, which was easy. The second was, describe why you want to go. He sat with it for a while. He thought about sitting with it, which his mother would have called stalling, but which he preferred to think of as the appropriate weight given to something that deserved it. He thought about Nolan Cruz in his apartment, haunted by his dead self in the bathtub, and the question the film kept asking, whether a person could be so afraid of the future that they refused to move toward it, whether that fear could be broken open by something as simple as the same morning arriving again and again, until the person inside it made a different choice. He thought about what it felt like on the 5th loop morning to push himself into the Sector 4 concourse, through the standing water resistance, earning each step. He thought about what it felt like to pull the phase regulator and hear the violet scatter change. He thought about a floor made of space, and how it was easier to look at the stars than at the faces you couldn't find words for. Then he typed, because she looked like she'd been waiting long enough. He submitted it. He didn't hear back right away. He went to school. He helped carry 3 first-year students' equipment up the hill because the gravity ramp was broken again. He ate lunch with Jun, who had decided to apply to the exchange program too, which surprised him and didn't, which was how most of the things Jun did felt. He came home. He sat on the roof and looked at the stars through the dome's viewport. He woke up at 0614, which didn't mean anything this time, just morning, just the ordinary kind, just the frost in the usual configuration and the grow lamps warming to yellow, and the whole unremarkable fact of another day beginning. He got dressed. He went outside. There was nobody on the retaining wall. He walked to school alone, in the early light, and the dome hummed around him with its recycled air, and its 5,000-some-odd lives all doing whatever they did in the first minutes of the morning before anybody was watching. And he thought about a ship the size of a moon somewhere past the visible sky, an amber bioluminescence that never flickered, and silver-blue light that brightened by measurable degrees, and a girl who could have walked for 6 weeks and chose not to. He thought about what it meant to choose. He thought about what it meant to stop at a wall. He was on time to physics for the first time in 4 months. His teacher looked up from her screen, noted this without comment, and returned to her screen. It was a small kindness, the kind that didn't announce itself, that cost nothing except the decision to let something pass without making it smaller by remarking on it. That, Eli thought, was the thing about humans. They were full of those gestures. Inconveniently, stubbornly, without calculation or audience or reward. They stopped at walls. They extended credit. They spent 3 off-shift hours on gravity mats for strangers. They carried people who could walk. They showed up late and they showed up anyway. And when the morning came again, they chose it again, without ceremony or declaration, just the ordinary stubborn act of a species that had never quite learned when it was supposed to give up. The Dominion had looked at this settlement and seen a resource. Vale's mother had looked at it and seen a question. Eli had looked at a girl on a wall and seen someone who'd been waiting long enough. All 3 of them were right. That was the thing about perspective. It didn't cancel the others out. It just added to them. You layered the views until you got something close to true, and true was all you ever actually got, not perfect, not complete, just close enough to act on. He sat down in physics. The teacher began. Outside the dome, beyond the dead zone's violet edge, the sky was full of stars going about their enormous, indifferent business, and somewhere in that sky, a message was traveling at the speed of whatever technology Vale's mother used, carrying his answer toward a ship that was larger than most moons. He had been asked why he wanted to go. The honest version was simpler than the words he'd used, simpler than anything he'd found vocabulary for, and it was this: the world did not expand until you moved through it. Moving through it meant choosing to. Choosing meant stopping first at walls, then at doors, then at the edge of whatever the next thing was that looked like it had been waiting long enough. Every morning. Deliberately. Again.